New Hampshire banned child marriage last year, but now they're considering a loophole because who doesn't love an exception? Welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, where we break down the laws shaping our country, sometimes feeling like we're moving forward, and sometimes, well, not so much. I'm Sarah, and with me, as always, is my legislative partner in crime and deep dives, Stephen.
Hey everybody! So today's topic is one that really does make you do a double take. Child marriage laws in the US. Is it still a thing that children get married? Oh yes it is. Just when you think progress is being made to make it not a thing, a new bill pops up that throws everything into reverse.
It's really interesting, the time that we're in right now. I feel like we're kind of getting pulled into different directions. It's felt like for a while in our country, and it's something where it seems there is a narrative of these family values and we need to protect these and kind of drive these forward. But then it's really interesting because bills like this, you would think that child marriage is not part of family values, but for reasons that we'll kind of get into later, the bills that we're talking about today have to do with the military and all these other things, and it's all kind of super threaded. There's issues about increasing divorce and demographic time bombs and, women not having enough babies, and it's kind of all over the place right now.
Yes, it is, isn't it? And it does seem to be polarizing more and more, as with a lot of things in the US as well. So on the one side, you've got conservatives arguing for traditional family values, and what they often mean by that is obviously traditional family setups where you have a man and a woman who are married together and raise children that way. Whereas on the left, there's a lot more openness to the idea of sort of non-traditional families. And so how does this feed in, really? Who is it who's supporting child marriage? Well, to be honest, no one is really supporting sort of child marriage. As we'll see, there's a general move sort of against it, though it is a very traditional practice, of course. The idea that only 18-year-olds will get married is a relatively recent one. I think largely because in the past, if you go back a couple of centuries, most people wouldn't make it out of their 20s. So, you needed people to get married as early as possible so they could actually have children and provide the next generation, because so many of them would die. Now, obviously, because we're all living a lot longer, that's no longer an issue. And obviously, generally speaking, populations aren't an issue either. Even though birth rates are declining massively, there's still a lot of us about. And so there's no real reason to want to go out and sort of repopulate the world, because there's still a lot of us there. So I think there's a conspiring force to say that because of all of the potential harmful effects of young people, particularly young girls, getting married, that there's a move away from it. And despite certain sort of unpleasant elements, such as natalism. I mean, natalism is a sort of a weird thing that's come up recently. And it's basically saying that because birth rates are declining so alarmingly all over the Western world, we need ways to reverse them. Most people would agree that's true. Birth rates are declining. It's a problem. It's an issue. Let's see what we can do about it. So that their solution, though, of course, is a lot of it is around making sure that women take up their traditional role as effectively baby making machines, and putting in place structures and legislation and so on that makes that happen. And one of those, of course, is restricting contraception, restricting abortion, and so on, so that women will have more babies. But certainly, in terms of the topic of children getting married, generally speaking, most people are opposed to that.
It's interesting with the way that the U.S. is attempting to address a lot of these things. And it is funny when you think about the past and how we weren't alive that long, lifetimes were condensed and those types of things. And, looking now, one, it's really expensive to be alive, and most households have to be dual income if you even want a chance at paying for your rent and childcare and all of those other things. And we don't really have any safety nets here to make it easier to have children. And so a big reason why the birth rate is on decline is people just can't afford it. And some people are on the line, and it's like, well, if I'm on the line and I can't afford it, then the answer is no. Whereas if we had better safety nets and other things like that to support, then maybe that would pick back up. And at the end of the day, when you have a kid, your career suffers, especially if you're the birthing parent, but also generally with parents, like you're sleeping less, you're stressed out, there's things taking you away from your career. You can't, put your entire heart and soul into your career anymore, like we love to do here in the States. But it's a really interesting thing where people are wanting their cake cake and eating it too, but it's like, hey, we don't have any sugar, so this cake is not tasty,
Yeah, that's right. And it is women, of course, who are driving this all over the world. So yeah, when you look in very poor countries, you'll often find that women will generally have about 10 babies or whatever. But as soon as women start to get a little bit of education, a little bit more money to spend, they suddenly realize that they don't have to do that. And then, in fact, if they only have one or two kids, then they can provide those kids with a much better life. And that's a general pattern that's been repeated for centuries now and is driving this. And in the modern world, of course, it's the same thing, really. As I say, raising kids is so expensive. You want to give your kids the best. If you have 4 kids, you can't do that. If you have 1 or 2, you can.
With the speaking of children, let's get into things. So before we kind of start talking about these bills, what do we actually mean when we say child marriage?
Yes. So we're talking about things in the past when very, very young children would get married. And there are, all over the world, there are certain very unpleasant sort of practices where young, often prepubescent girls would be forced into marriages. And we're not really talking about that in the United States. It's not really children who are getting married. It's basically anybody who is under the age of 18. And so the vast majority, you're talking about 16 and 17-year-olds, actually. And most states, for some time, or forever really, have had some very severe restrictions or bans on children younger than that getting married. So let's just see what you know about this. A little pop quiz here. So what do you think are the 2 states in the United States with the lowest legal marriage age currently?
Maybe Utah and Alaska? I'm not sure.
Yeah, you would. Utah springs to mind for sort of obvious reasons. They're sort of renowned for their sort of very traditional approaches to marriage. But actually, no, it's not Utah or in fact Alaska. It's Kansas and Hawaii. And certainly Hawaii surprised me. I was really less surprised about Kansas, but certainly Hawaii surprised me. So both Kansas and Hawaii currently allow marriage at 15, though only with a court order. And I suspect it's very, very difficult to get married, actually, and I doubt it happens very much. But it is the law. And Kansas, introduced a limit, raising the age to 15 in 2006. So it's fairly recently, and I think it was following quite an unpleasant case where a young girl was sort of pressured into marrying a quite unpleasant person. I think it might have been to do with rape and so on. So, or nasty. So they did that, but they only then raised it to 15. Utah, though, is very interesting when it comes to marriage. So it has the lowest average age of marriage. So even though in Utah, I think the minimum age is 16, but you do need parental consent at 16 or 17. But they do tend to get married on average earlier than most people. And also, and probably not coincidentally, the longest average length of marriage is also Utah. So their marriages, they tend to stay married longer. They get married earlier and they stay married. So there must be something in that Mormonism thing.
I wonder if people who are married to multiple people are also counting in that timeline that's getting measured. Because that might have an impact too. Okay, so why are states raising the minimum age? Like, what's wrong with a 16 or 17-year-old getting married?
Yes, it does. On the face of it, most people think, oh, well, there's got to be something wrong with that. But it is worth just exploring exactly what the problems are with this, given that it was a very, very common practice until fairly recently. So putting aside issues like consent, let's assume that the people who are getting married are actually consenting. Child welfare advocates point out that marriage before 18 is linked to things like higher dropout rates, domestic violence, and poverty. Minors also generally can't sign contracts, and that's important. So if you're under the age of 18, you're not allowed to sign a contract, which does raise the question, why are you then allowed to sign a marriage contract? But if you can't sign a contract and you can't actually hire a lawyer, which you often can't do until you're 18, how do you then file for divorce? Often you would need parental permission. If your parents don't want you to get divorced, you literally would not be able to get divorced if you're below the age of 18, if your marriage is not working out. And this is actually a cycle that sort of traps these young people in situations that they can't easily escape. And obviously, we all know how most of us probably aren't very good at making decisions when it comes to matters of the heart. And if we think back to when we were 15, 16, 17, I mean, would you trust 16-year-old you to make that decision about getting married? So it's a big decision. Big decision, and perhaps even though it sounds a little bit patronizing to these young people, perhaps they should wait a couple of years. If they're genuinely in love, it will last a couple of years and they get married when they're 18. But let's also be clear what we're talking about here when we talk about children getting married. So according to Unchained at Last, it's an organization that works in this space, there were nearly 300,000 minors under the age of 18 legally married in the US between 2000 and 2018. So it's quite a lot, but obviously if you think about the number of people who got married over that period, it's a relatively small percentage. A few of them are as young as 10, but virtually all of them were 16 or 17. So that is really the age that we're talking about here. And most were girls. So it's a huge percentage of young people who get married are girls. It's not boys. And they were wed to adult men who are an average of 4 years older than them. So there is definitely a pattern here. It's young girls being married to older men. It's not really, in most of these cases, not like a Romeo and Juliet situation, star-crossed lovers in youngsters in love and that kind of thing. It's altogether murkier than that.
Yeah, and there might be things that are kind of at play there, like maybe you're a freshman and your boyfriend was a senior, and then got 2 years later and they're 20 and you're 16 or whatever it is. And given these kind of different age gaps, maybe they're not super predatory, but it is kind of weird. My husband and I are 5 years apart, but thinking about me being 16 and him being 21, like, ugh. That's weird.
It's different, isn't it? It's different.
Yeah, and I mean, into the bills, this time it's happening in New Hampshire, and that's a state that just last year made headlines for finally raising the minimum age of marriage to 18 with no exceptions. But now they have this new House Bill 433, which is on the table, and it's causing quite a stir. Stephen, can you give us a quick rundown on what this bill's proposing?
Absolutely, yeah. So HB 433 introduces a military exception to the state's child marriage ban. So basically, it would allow 17-year-olds to marry if one of the parties is an active duty service member. If the minor is a civilian, they would need parental consent to marry. So it's a stark contrast, really, to last year's Senate Bill 359, which was celebrated for eliminating all exceptions to child marriage in New Hampshire.
Okay, so let's get this straight. In New Hampshire, they passed a landmark bill banning child marriage without exceptions in 2024, last year. And now, this year, less than a year later, they're already trying to carve out new loopholes.
That's right. And it does raise some serious concerns, really. So advocates against child marriage, like Unchained at Last and Equality Now, argue that making these exceptions, even for military service, undermines the entire point of SB 359 and creates a dangerous precedent for other states to follow.
I think the justification for these bills is it's tied to the idea that if someone is old enough to serve in the military, they should be old enough to marry. And a lot of people who do enlist are younger. And it might not be something that's super predatory. You might be 18 and have a 16-year-old girlfriend. That's not super weird. And there is the rule where you have to be married to be able to have your partner on base. So you can't bring your girlfriend or get any of those benefits and other things like that.
You're absolutely right to say that marriage provides access to all sorts of military benefits. You've got the housing, you've got the healthcare for spouses and so on. But the opponents to this law say that service members can already designate beneficiaries for things like life insurance and death benefits, regardless of their marital status. So the argument that marriage is necessary for sort of the benefits that accrue from being a member of the military doesn't fully hold up.
And I mean, what do the numbers say? How big of an issue was child marriage in New Hampshire before last year's ban?
Well, between 2000 and 2023, records show there was about 215 minors married in New Hampshire. 83% of these cases involved girls marrying adult men. So while it may not be happening on a massive scale, the impact on those affected is quite huge, really. And rolling back protections for even a small group is quite concerning.
Right. And stepping back for a second, how does this bill fit into the broader picture of child marriage in the U.S.? Are we seeing any more trends, or what's kind of going on here?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are definite trends. There's a lot of legislation that's been floating around over the past few years. A lot of it's been enacted as well. So since 2018, really, states have been moving towards banning child marriage entirely. Delaware and New Jersey led the way. But since then, 19 other states have enacted stricter laws. And there are 26 bills currently addressing child marriage marriage in one way or another, moving through state legislatures this year. So most of these, like bills in Oregon and Texas, aim to eliminate all exceptions and set the minimum age at 18. That's by far the most common things that states are moving to do. But it is worth looking at Missouri. Missouri currently has 6 bills addressing aspects of child marriage, sort of coming at it from different directions. It sort of reflects a real ongoing debate in the state around child marriage. So 2 of these bills, SB 66 and SB 631, genuine bipartisan attempts to outlaw child marriage with no exceptions, and the sponsors are quite positive that these might actually pass. But a few others have been introduced by other people as well, sort of approaching it in other ways. So HB 484, for example, doesn't go quite as far in that it does also allow emancipated minors to marry. So this is quite a common exception you do see. So if minors have actually gone through a legal process to emancipate them, then why on earth shouldn't they be considered to be adults? Is sort of the argument there. You've got another bill, which is HB 1021, which is quite an interesting one. It sort of looked at the issues with child marriage that we spoke about earlier, and it says, okay, well, what we'll do then is we will allow married minors to file for divorce without the consent of a parent and a guardian. Sort of removing one of those problems. There's another one, which is HB 491, which goes even further than this, and will allow married minors to actually contract for a variety of different services, housing, student loans, medical care, and so on, which are currently restricted to over 18s. And then another state that's addressing it is Oklahoma. So Oklahoma is always good for a wackier bill. We do tend to talk about Oklahoma quite a lot here. So you've got HB 1997, which does allow minors to marry, but only where a court has previously conferred upon them the rights of majority, so they've been emancipated. But there's also a further restriction which allows marriage between under 16s only where the marriage settles a paternity suit or where the unmarried female is pregnant, and only with specific court authorization, parental involvement, and so on. So what they're effectively doing is codifying a shotgun wedding.
It's very interesting. Progress is happening, but the exceptions, they keep popping up. And these carves outs, like the one in New Hampshire, and, shotgun weddings, all of these types of things, they can potentially unravel some really hard-won protections that a lot of people have been fighting for a long time. So what is the concern if this bill passes?
Well, the biggest fear is that once one state makes an exception, others will follow. I mean, obviously, one of the big things about America is that each state is in a little laboratory where you can test things out. And so the states do tend to copy each other's legislation. It's a good thing because it means you can say, well, it's worked over here, so let's adopt it in our state as well. But there are parallels being drawn to how the overturning of Roe v. Wade led to a wave of new abortion restrictions. And advocates do worry that allowing a rollback, even for a specific group like this, does send a signal that child marriage laws are negotiable. As with these things, you can argue it's a thin end of the wedge, it's a slippery slope, and so on. What you need is an absolute no. We're not going to allow it, and that's the only way you can stop it.
All right. Well, what happens next with HB 433?
Well, New Hampshire legislators have until June the 13th. To decide the fate of this bill. It's currently making its way through committees and so on, and the advocacy groups are pushing hard to stop it, really. The next few months will be key in determining whether New Hampshire keeps its child marriage ban intact or starts chipping away at it.
Well, we'll be keeping a close eye on this one. Child marriage is an issue that shouldn't need constant defense, but here we are, and if you want to follow along, check out BillTrack 50's real-time bill tracking database for updates on child marriage legislation across the country.
Absolutely. And you can check out my blog as well. I've put in there links to all the bills that we've spoken about today, as well as a constantly updated list of all this legislation so you can follow along. So also let us know what you think. So should military service justify a lower marriage age? Is New Hampshire setting a dangerous precedent? Drop us a comment or find us on Blue Sky and join the conversation, because this debate is far from over.
That's it for this episode, and don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and most importantly, keep looking beyond the bill number. We'll see you soon.